Hello everyone. Did you know that 80% of those who watch my videos have not subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Also, don't forget to leave a like and tell us your thoughts in the comments. It really helps the channel grow. Thank you for watching. I took 6 months off after Harrow Point. Tried to convince myself it was just stress, just isolation, doing what the captain had warned me about. I saw a therapist for a while. She prescribed medication for anxiety, suggested I find work on the mainland, somewhere with people around me. But after 3 months of stocking shelves at a hardware store, listening to the constant noise of customers and co-workers, I realized something. The isolation hadn't broken me. It had changed me. I couldn't function in the normal world anymore. The constant chatter, the crowds, the artificial lights, they felt wrong, oppressive. I needed the silence. I needed the ocean. When the call came for another rotation, I didn't hesitate. I took it. Widow's Watch, Oregon coast. January through February, 8 weeks. The station manager's briefing was shorter this time, more matter of fact, like he was already expecting me to refuse. Previous keeper lasted 3 days, he said, not looking up from his paperwork. Cited personal reasons. You'll be alone the entire rotation. Weather's rough this time of year. We're talking sustained winds over 50 knots, waves high enough to breach the lower platform. Power outages are common. You comfortable with that? I said I was. I didn't mention Harrow Point. Didn't mention the footprints or the fabric or the entry I never wrote. Didn't mention that I still check my apartment door every morning for wet prints. I just took the job and signed the paperwork. The Lighthouse was older than Harrow Point, built in the 1920s, perched on a narrow ridge of rock that jutted out into the Pacific like an accusing finger. The structure was weathered and beaten, the white paint peeling in long strips, revealing layers of older paint beneath. Grey, then yellow, then something that might have been red once, though it was hard to tell through the corrosion and salt damage. The tower itself leaned slightly to the northeast, just enough to notice if you stood back and looked at it against the horizon. The station manager had assured me it was structurally sound, that it had been leaning like that for decades. But it still looked wrong, like the whole thing might topple into the sea at any moment. The boat captain who dropped me off was different from the one at Harrow Point. Younger, less talkative, with the weathered skin of someone who'd spent too many years on the water. He helped me unload my gear without much conversation, his movements efficient and practiced. Then he paused before climbing back onto his boat, 1 foot on the dock, 1 on the deck. "How long did the last keeper stay?" I asked. 3 days, like they told you." "What happened?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching my face as if trying to gauge whether I could handle the truth. Said he heard things, voices, footsteps. Said something was watching him from the water. Called it in on the second night. Said he needed to leave immediately. We told him to wait for the scheduled pickup. He called again the next morning, said if we didn't come get him that day, he was going to take one of the emergency rafts and try to paddle to shore himself. "Do you believe him?" He shrugged, his expression unreadable. "I've been running this route for 5 years. I've picked up a lot of people early. They all say similar things. Whether I believe them doesn't matter. Something about these places gets to people. Maybe it's the isolation, maybe it's something else. Either way, the result's the same." He left, and I watched his boat disappear into the fog, the sound of the engine fading until there was nothing but the crash of waves against rock and the cry of gulls wheeling overhead. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I did my work, checked the beacon, logged the weather in the station logbook. The isolation felt familiar now, almost comfortable, like slipping into an old coat that fit perfectly. I'd learned to appreciate the silence, to let it settle around me instead of fighting it. I'd learned that the absence of sound wasn't emptiness. It was space. Room to think, to breathe, to exist without the constant assault of modern life. On the third night, fog rolled in. Thick, impenetrable fog that pressed against the windows like something solid, like a living thing trying to find a way inside. The beacon cut through it in sweeping arcs, the light diffusing into the moisture, creating strange halos and shadows. And then I heard it. A foghorn, distant but clear, coming from the wrong direction. I checked my charts, spreading them out on the small table in the control room. There were no other lighthouses within audible range. The nearest station was 15 miles south, too far for the sound to carry, even in perfect conditions. No ships were scheduled in this area. The shipping lanes were miles to the west, but the foghorn continued, low and mournful, echoing across the water with a regularity that felt almost mechanical. It sounded every few minutes, and with each repetition it seemed to get closer. Not louder exactly, but closer, as if whatever was making the sound was circling the lighthouse in a slow, deliberate spiral, moving inward with each pass. This continued for 8 days. Every night, as soon as darkness fell, the fog would roll in, thick and cold and wrong, and the foghorn would start. It would circle the lighthouse for hours, getting closer and closer, until it felt like it was right outside the walls, just beyond the reach of the beacon's light. Then at dawn, it would stop. The fog would lift like a curtain being drawn back, and everything would be silent again. The sea would be calm, the sky clear, as if nothing had happened. On the 6th night, I saw something in the fog. A figure, tall and indistinct, standing at the edge of the rocks about 50 feet from the lighthouse door. It was wearing what looked like an old keeper's uniform, the kind they wore in the 1920s, with the heavy wool coat and the brass buttons catching the light from the beacon as it swept past. The figure stood perfectly still, facing the lighthouse, not moving, not reacting to the wind or the spray or the sweeping light. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, the cold hitting me like a physical blow. The fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in front of me, the beam of my flashlight just reflecting back off the moisture. I called out, but there was no answer. Just the fog and the distant sound of waves and my own breathing loud in my ears. When I reached the spot where the figure had been standing, there was nothing. Just wet rock and fog, and the edge of the cliff dropping away into darkness. The next morning, I found something that made my hands shake. On the inside of my door, pressed against the metal, was a handprint. But it was pressed from the inside, palm facing out, fingers splayed, as if someone had been standing inside the lighthouse, inside the room where I slept, trying to get out, not in. The print was wet, leaving streaks of moisture running down the metal surface. I spent that day researching the lighthouse's history on the aging computer in the office. I found records going back to its construction in 1923. The first keeper was a man named Thomas Marsh. He'd worked there for 6 months before requesting a transfer. In his final report, filed with the Coast Guard in September 1923, he mentioned hearing voices for weeks. Voices calling to him from the water, from the fog, from places he couldn't identify. Voices that knew his name, that whispered things about his past, about his family, about mistakes he'd made. He was the only keeper who'd lasted more than a year. Everyone after him had left early. Personal reasons every time. The same phrase repeated in report after report, decade after decade. The lighthouse had been automated in 1987, but even the maintenance crews reported strange occurrences. Equipment failures that couldn't be explained. Unexplained sounds recorded on audio monitors. The persistent feeling of being watched, even when alone on the rock. On the eastern side of the island I found the tide pools. I'd noticed them before during my initial survey of the station, but I'd never examined them closely. They were deep, much deeper than normal tide pools, carved into the rock by centuries of wave action. And the water in them was dark. It didn't reflect the sky like normal water. It just sat there, black and still, like oil, like something thick and wrong. The largest pool was maybe 15 feet across, perfectly circular, as if it had been carved deliberately rather than formed naturally. I knelt beside it and looked down into the water. At first I saw nothing but darkness. Then, slowly, something rose from the depths. A face, human, but wrong. The features were distorted, stretched, the proportions all off. The skin was grey and waterlogged, swollen and soft-looking, like something that had been submerged for months. The eyes were completely black, no whites, no pupils, just solid black orbs that stared up at me without blinking, without any expression at all. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering, my hands scraping against the rough stone. When I looked again, the face was gone. The water was still and dark, showing nothing but my own pale reflection looking back at me. But I heard a voice in my head, not in my ears, in my head, bypassing all normal channels of sound. 2 words, barely a whisper, spoken with an eagerness that made my skin crawl. "Come down." I ran back to the lighthouse and locked the door, throwing the heavy bolt and checking it twice. That night, I heard scratching underneath the foundation. Not scraping like at Harrow Point, but scratching, like fingernails on stone, like something trying to dig its way up through solid rock. It moved in circles around the lighthouse, following the same path the foghorn had taken, spiraling inward. At low tide the next morning, I forced myself to go back to the tide pools. I had to know. I had to see. I had to understand what was down there. The water level had dropped significantly, exposing the bottom of the largest pool. It was covered in handprints. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed into the rock like fossils, all pointing upward, all reaching toward the surface. Some were small, like children's hands. Others were large, the fingers long and distorted. All of them were reaching up, desperate, frozen in stone. Near the edge of the pool, someone had carved words into the stone with what looked like a knife or a chisel. The letters were crude and uneven, cut deep. "They are below." I radioed for extraction that afternoon. I didn't wait for approval. I just called and said I was leaving, that I needed to leave now, that I wasn't going to stay another night. They told me it would be 2 days. The weather was turning, a storm moving in from the west, and they couldn't send a boat until it cleared. I'd have to wait. I'd have to survive 2 more nights. Those 2 nights were worse than anything at Harrow Point. The foghorn and the scratching would alternate, sometimes overlapping, like they were having a conversation. The foghorn would sound long and low, then the scratching would answer, moving faster, more frantic, back and forth all night long. And through it all I heard that voice in my head, whispering the same 2 words over and over. "Come down. Come down. Come down." On my final morning, I saw the figure again, standing in the fog, wearing that old keeper's uniform with the brass buttons. This time I could see his face clearly. It was Thomas Marsh. I recognized him from the photograph in the historical records, the same narrow face, the same deep-set eyes. But he'd disappeared in 1923, over 100 years ago. The record said he'd requested a transfer, but there was no documentation of him ever reaching the mainland. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, watching, his black eyes fixed on me, until the boat arrived and I left. As we pulled away from the dock, I looked back one last time. He was still there, standing on the rocks, watching me go. And behind him, in the tide pool, I could see faces rising to the surface. Dozens of them, all watching, all waiting. 3 months later, I started receiving emails. Anonymous, no return address, no subject line. Each one contained a single photograph of the tide pool, and in each photograph, the face was visible, rising from the water, its black eyes staring at the camera. And with each new email, the face was closer to the surface. The water level dropping, the features becoming clearer. I still hear the foghorn sometimes. Late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, distant but getting closer with each passing week. And the scratching underneath my apartment floor, moving in circles, spiraling inward, getting closer,